box has a brand new pack of cards. Let's see what's inside.
Hey guys, welcome back. Long time no see. I know I've been out of the picture for a while, but I've caught myself up on all the new fan-made cards, even some of the rules and the ban list. Since I'm finally coming back, and since we have completed the first cycle of the new fan-made cards, I'm finally going to do in Daznak's pit. Let's open her up and see what's inside. So starting off, we have Bear Island Scout. Classic House Mormont card. There seem to be so many of them. It's loyal, as they all are. When you play it, if everything is a Stark, you can search your whole deck for any House Mormont card, add it to your hand, shuffle your deck. The Mormonts in general support the same type of thing that this is trying to do, which is basically a Stark sub-strategy of just pure Starks, nothing else. This in particular is loyal. I don't really know enough about the Starks to speak to this in general, but it's just obvious where it's coming from, and this searchability is insane. I don't know what the best targets in the card pool are, but I know that it's a pretty big card pool. I'm going to say this is a great option as a 2-cost, like first turn. Digon, really good card. Next we have Skagos. It's a shadow location, and it's pretty interesting. You wouldn't necessarily want to actually shadow this card because it doesn't necessarily interact with your opponent unless they know the ins and outs of what you're trying to do with your deck really well. I don't think it's necessary to pay the 3 cost, especially if you draw this in like setup or something. But man, this allows you to do something really interesting. So you sacrifice a star character you control and search your deck for a card with the same name and put it into play. I guess what this could do technically is just at any point get rid of some kind of target for let's say put to the sword or something and just replace it with a new copy. But what it also allows you to do is get rid of copies of cards that have the same name as a card with a different effect, like the multiple types of, Jon Snow or Ned Stark or Catelyn or Sansa or Arya. There's 3 Aryas. You can swap them out for different versions without having to necessarily play them as duplicates or get stuck with the same one. I really like what this does because there's not a lot of ways to do that. The only other card that I can think of that really encourages you to run multiple different versions of the character with the same name is like Arianne Martell in Dorne, because there's 2 versions of her that return to your hand so you could play the other ones. I really think that's a cool feature, and I like what this card does. I don't really know why it's a shadow card, but sure, why not? It's also the North location, which means that it'll synergize with that new Stark loyal 5-cost lord. I think Ricard Karstark. Seems like most of them are, so whatever, and you wouldn't necessarily want to kneel this because it has to kneel itself for its effect, but worth noting, it's not an unsupported trait. Next up is Brightwater Host. It is a Tyrell card, 6 cost, but unfortunately not unique, so you can't use Great Hall. However, it is a House Florent card, which is pretty funny because it gets minor support from Baratheons, even though most of the Florents are in here. But Alistair Florent could benefit from this. More importantly, it's an army. There's a lot of new support for armies, and there's a lot of old support for armies. Unfortunately, after learning of the restricted list, I learned that the 1-card busted neutral location high ground is banned because that card would go very well with this. But you don't need that to make use of this card. It's super searchable now as an army because of the brand new neutral card Brave Companions, which is just frankly busted. And another thing that's cool about this is that if you are playing a Tyrell Kingdom of Shadows deck, which is reasonable. They have a lot of shadow support. You can run Aegon Targaryen because he's a non-loyal shadow card. Or, you could also just do that if you were running Tyrell's or Targaryen combo deck because both of those cards are non-loyal. But especially in a Kingdom of Shadows deck, this would make for a good target for him because its ability has to do with Shadow. You pick a card in Shadow and you return it to its owner's hand. Then a unique, so it can't apply to itself because it's not unique Tyrell character gets a power. So it definitely does want to stay in faction, but it would be pretty cool to bring it out with Aegon, use it during the middle of the phase, and then just give 2 power onto something you have and then just mic drop this back to your hand. Other than that, It's expensive. I think there's like Rose Road Patrol or one or two other Tyrell army cards. I'm not really sure about them. This trait is being much more supported now with the new cards. And there's always classics like Muster the Realm if you want to increase claim. But I'm not sure what a Tyrell army deck would look like. It does suck for him that he has no attachments. You can still use Tyrell events to buff him, but not attachments. Overall, I see what they're doing with this. It's weird that it's a non-shadow card, but it, affects shadow cards. Yeah, obviously, if your opponent has shadow cards, this is probably more helpful. There's no intrinsic benefit or like trap you could fall into. No benefit for your opponent for having a shadow card returned to their hand. Might even make them go over reserve, which is kind of funny, and you get 2 power, which is pretty good. He just has to win a challenge. Unfortunate that I can't think of a single way that you could use this guy on your own shadow cards for any particular reason other than getting the power. I can't think of a reason why you would want to put shadow cards back in your hand necessarily, unless maybe random intrigue fodder if you're really worried about losing your last card. But either way, it's most consistent to play this guy definitely in a deck where you have shadow cards, so you don't have to worry about your opponent having targets. Although if you do, you should definitely aim for them. And speaking of events that can buff Tyrell characters, or any characters really, we have the 3-cost event, the Might of the Reach. Now, 3 costs for an event is like super steep and pretty telegraphed. If you're not using shadow cards and you go into the challenges phase with 3 gold, your opponent is going to be concerned, especially with Tyrells who are known for having these kinds of events. This card is just hilarious. I mean, it's a classic. You just pick any participating character. It doesn't actually have to be Tyrell. No traits required. Till the end of the challenge, that character gets plus 10 strength. Now, that's an absurd amount of strength. Really good for triggering other events like Put to the Sword, Put to the Torch, Support of the People, to name a few, but you're going to need even more gold for that. That would definitely go in an event-heavy Tyrell deck that was probably running Annals of Castle Black, maybe even Dark Wings, Dark Words. There's a version of the Queen of Thorns that's very good with events. There's also a version of Brienne who cares about, she gets different things for you depending on how much strength she wins the challenge by. So this isn't necessarily as pointless of overkill as it seems, but just having this plus 10 strength be printed on a card is so funny. This is loyal, so you're gonna have to say in faction, but it works best, I think, with cards in faction. Lastly, most savage thing you could do with this is obviously use it on your opponent. Use it on your opponent's character for some reason that I can't really think of right now, but to make yourself lose a challenge by a certain amount of strength. Don't know what that would trigger. Can't think of a reason why you would want to do that, but it would be so sassy. So if you can find a reason to, I'm going to try and think of one, but comment below if you can think of any situation ever, doesn't have to be consistent, where you would use the Might of the Reach on your opponent's character during a challenge. Next up is actually a completely overpowered card that they've since errata. This is the original version of Three-Fingered Hob, which says, after you check reserve, if your hand size is lower than your reserve value, draw 2 cards. That's insane because he's a steward, right? And stewards have a lot of ability to gain reserve, but it's also just really not hard to build your deck or even just by accident be under your reserve. Drawing 2 is busted. That might actually put you over reserve, but it's after you check reserve, so it doesn't even matter. Now, the new version of Three-Fingered Hob is not nearly as busted as this, because this kind of consistent card advantage on a 2 cost is insane. He's still good though. He has an ability where after you check your hand size, if you're under reserve, you draw 1 card, or if you're under reserve by at least 5, then you draw 2. That is basically just forcing you to not exploit this guy's ability in any deck, but particularly a steward deck, because 1 card, it's not bad, it's nothing to scoff at, but stewards are the faction of the Night's Watch compared to like builders or rangers that really focuses on reserve, which in itself is like kind of a frivolous stat compared to a lot of other ones. Getting your opponent down to low reserve can be okay. Having high reserve is not intrinsically good unless you're using the Night's Watch Defenders of the Wall card, whose strength is equal to your reserve, or cards like Eastwatch by the Sea and this that are exploiting that reserve to draw into a lot of stuff. If that stuff is more reserve, you're going to go nowhere. So you need to find the right balance. But this guy, this version, this old one, busted, insane. The only annoying thing about him, because he is so splashable into any Night's Watch deck, is that he's loyal. because there are a lot of Night's Watch decks that can get away with running Hollow Hill without a huge sacrifice. This guy is just so good, though, that it doesn't matter. Even the new version of him is really good. It's really good for the Steward strategy, and is still pretty splashable if you're running, let's say, something like Winter Reserves, because maybe you want to use some Winter Plot cards for things like, I don't know, Cotter Pike and maybe Mance Raider if you're doing like a bit of Wildling shenanigans. Yeah, you might as well just use this guy, exploit the extra reserve you're getting from Winter Reserves that is probably not as important as the gold. Real insane card. Such a good card that they have had to errata him, because otherwise he straight up would have been banned. Like, no question. Okay, next we have, similar to Skagos, another 2-cost shadow location. This one is Night's Watch, though, but it's also at the north location, so that's worth looking into because it's non-loyal, so you could use, again, Ricard Karstark. I guess most Night's Watch locations might have that, so there's your combo deck. I mean, there's a version of Ghost that can save Stark or Night's Watch characters, so that combo deck is just asking to be made. This one's a little more interesting than Skagos. Well, no, it's not as interesting as Skagos. Skagos is sick. But this one actually incentivizes you to pay the shadow mechanic, because honestly, if your opponent knows you have this and you can just sacrifice it during dominance to choose a standing character that they control, then they're not going to keep any of their good characters standing. First of all, you don't even actually choose. They're the ones who choose. So this situation would be best if they just left one guy standing because you blocked a challenge that they didn't think you would, and then you just don't declare any attacks, and then you bring this out of shadow and make them kill their best guy. But because they choose, unfortunately, sometimes they might be able to just kill, I don't know, like a 1-cost Iron Islands Fishmonger. This is also helpful because it sacrifices the character instead of killing it, which normally wouldn't be as good, but for Night's Watch decks that can use the Wall or the Old Bear or Night Gathers, this is helpful for putting them in the discard pile so that you can steal them and recruit them to the Night's Watch. So this is a pretty cool card because it sacrifices itself. If you'd like, you can run it with the 4-cost version of King's Landing that lets you marshal cards from the discard pile, which would combo well with other things like Flea Bottom Alley. But in this card's case, the surprise factor would be gone, so I don't really think that would be worth it. I think this is a really hard card to use without outshadowing it, but you could try and use Defiance to stand their cards at the last second if they're a Maester or like a Marshalling Helper. If they knelt using their ability and didn't participate in the challenge, you can stand them at the last minute. I guess go for it if you want to. I really think you should probably shadow this card, but just like last time, if you can find a situation where you stand your opponent's characters at the last second to use this card without keeping it telegraphed, comment below, that'd be dope. Okay, this is not one of my favorite cards. It's called Storm's End Maester. Now, he's a 2-cost, and he is a non-unique Maester. Maester is an incredible trait. You can use the plot card Outwit. You can search him with Here to Serve. You can give him Insight with Glass Candle. But the problem is he's loyal, which means you can't use him in a Conclave deck. You have to use him in a Baratheon deck. I guess you could make a Baratheon Conclave deck. I don't know if that would be the best faction to choose. His ability is pretty interesting. All Maesters have this thing where like they kneel themselves to use their ability, I've noticed, or at least most of them. And his is no exception. You kneel him to pick an opponent. In a joust, that's just going to be your opponent. And then if you have more power on your faction card than they do, draw a card. So if you go first in the challenges phase, even if you know that they're going to take the power back maybe and then some, if there's just one moment where during that challenges phase you have more power than them, you can kneel this guy whenever you want and draw a card. What's cool about him is that he's non-unique, right? So you can have 3 out and draw a few. But the problem is that, well, first of all, you're kneeling him, so you don't get to use his 1 strength in a power challenge. It's not the end of the world, and he is drawing you a card, and he's solid military fodder, especially because, again, he's not unique. But, like, you're kneeling him, and then Baratheons have a lot of kneel control support that sometimes affects you. I think there's a version of Stannis where you can't stand more than 2 characters, both players, like, during the standing phase. So this guy is probably just going to not stand. But then again, if you're running cards like that, you would be running cards like Defiance that would stand things that hadn't necessarily challenged. So in that case, this guy might synergize with that. I've always preferred the Baratheon power challenge synergy that has to do more directly with power challenges like Red Keep and Long May He Reign. Okay, not always. In a previous video, I kind of made fun of Long May He Reign, but I've come around to it. But this goes with the type of Baratheon synergy that is specifically about having more power than your opponent on your faction card. It's not about more power total, it's about on your faction card. You can make that happen with things like Stormland's Fiefdom, which has just a really weird ability for an econ card, but it's not unlimited. But anyway, overall, I would say he's one of the weaker maesters. He's an okay Baratheon card, but unfortunately the strategy he would be synergizing with, in my mind, wouldn't really make as good of use of his keyword as it could. I really, really like this next attachment. It's called Glamour. It's an item with the roller trait, so right away looking at it as a roller attachment, you can play it for pretty much free with, I think, Selyse Baratheon. I think they've eroded her as well. She used to just be busted. I think it was like all roller attachments you played reduced the cost by 3, and the only thing that it cost anything more than 0 at that point was the banned card Melisandre's Ruby from The Things We Do for Love, which is a sick card, but it's banned. Now I think it's like the first roller attachment you martially trap, but that's still really good. So this card is non-unique. You can have a couple of them, and if you play them outright, they're really helpful with Selyse. You can also shadow them though, which is a little bit sassier. It has a basic attached character gets +2 strength, but then what you can do is kill the attached character to resurrect something that was killed this phase. This has a lot of potential for shenanigans. First of all, like, I have a Renly base deck that uses the version of Renly that, like, kneel your faction card to play cards from your hand with a lower printed cost than his strength. And so if you're using something like that, not that you would want to kill Renly to resurrect something else, because the thing you would want to resurrect is probably Renly, you wouldn't use that ability, but just stacking your deck with cards that can give him more strength becomes honestly economical, and you can use this on other things. Baratheons tend to synergize really well with Ironborn because they both like dominance. Ironborn cards like to kill themselves. There's a bunch of Ironborn cards that are just, what is it, Drowned? It's not Drowned Disciple. It's Drowned God's Acolyte. It's just a 2 cost that when it dies, you gain a power. You could make it a little bit stronger and then just kill it whenever anything else died, gain a power, and then bring that thing back. Unfortunately, it is terminal, but like I said, it's non-unique. So you can run 3, you can have 3 out, you can have 3 in shadows if you want, just waiting. You don't necessarily need to outshadow it, but that extra 1 gold that you end up paying total would be worth it if your opponent is trying to do targeted removal and doesn't know that you have this out. This out would be good to escape from that. And last thing I'll say is that because it's an item, it is searchable by Streets of Steel. All right, moving on to the Lannisters, we have Painted Dogs. So it's a Clansman, it's 4 cost, and it has the same ambush cost as its printed cost, which is kind of awesome. You can return it to your hand to choose instead a Clansman character or Tyrion Lannister. Now, returning it to your hand seems like a cost, and in a lot of cases it is. But Lannisters have a lot of cards like Hear Me Roar, Lion Star, that bring cards from out of your hand, and then at the end of the challenges phase, they either die or get discarded or whatever. And so if you use those to bring him out, Lionstar can bring this guy out because Lionstar specifically targets 4 cost or lower. You can bring him back to your hand and he doesn't have to face the consequences of whatever cheap way you use to bring him out. This is a pretty recurring theme with a lot of Clansman decks. My friend has a really good one, Zach, shoutouts to Zach Rowan, that uses Tower of the Hand to return things back to the hand after bringing them out for cheap. It's kind of insane what you can do with a board like this with all these Clansmen. I mean, this guy has his own ambush, so if you have the extra gold, you don't even need to use your other locations and stuff. You can save those for other things in your hand. But a lot of the ways that these decks like to play is sometimes they've got nothing out, or 1 or 2 things during marshalling, and then in challenges they have like 5, and then they're gone again, so they're kind of immune to board wipes. I think this is a pretty good card. You would obviously be running him with the Clansman version of Tyrion, and you could also stand a different Clansman character. There's a lot of good ones. Milk Snakes is a new one that's really good. Lastly, there's also a location that can give Clansmen icons when they enter play during the challenges phase. This guy's missing one. Trigon Clansman for the win. I think this is a solid card. It's non-unique like most Clansmen, and it really just fits with the synergy of the deck. This next card is very, very interesting to me. So it's a 2 cost event, which is pretty steep. It's also Lannister Loyal, and it has the 7 trait. I'm not sure what support there is for the 7 events, but there might be. The 7 has a good amount of support, so it wouldn't surprise me. And this is a rare non-neutral, the 7 card. Not super rare, but there's not that many proof action. So it's a dominance action, so you save 2 gold for the very end. That's fine because you could sort of keep this in your hand, and then if you need to use that gold during the challenges phase for something else, perhaps to ambush a clansman, you can do it, or if you just happen to have it left over, you can use this card. So you discard any amount of power from a character you control, and then you draw a card for each one and discard a card from your opponent's hand. Now, lore-wise, this happened to Cersei Lannister, right? And I think it's kind of built to work with, I think, the 7-cost version of Cersei Lannister, who gets a power every time a card is discarded from your opponent's hand. You could play this for 2, draw 3, scrap 3 from your opponent's hand if you discard 3 power from her, and then she would gain the 3 power back because it's thrice per phase. That's really good. She would just get the power right back, which is a great little bit of lore balance synergy. But in other cases, this card is just kind of weird. It's a 2-cost event, which is a dominance action, which is kind of clunky in general. And you're moving further away from your win condition in order to change your opponent's hand size and yours. Admittedly, yes, each power that you lose increases the gap in at least hand card advantage by 2, which is pretty good. But like ultimately, if you really want to mess with your opponent's hand, you're gonna have to get rid of a good amount of power. And it's rare that I feel like you would assess a situation and be like, that's worth it. That's going to shut them down to the point where I can slide back in my power win condition for now and their resources will run out. They might have a plot card that'll mess with you. I mean, depends what kind of deck you're doing, but if you're doing a deck with something like Cersei is the one who would work best with this. But if you're doing a deck with like almost anything else that's relying on getting power on characters, it's probably usually better, especially if you have to pay 2 gold, to just keep those characters than to necessarily mess with people's hands in this way. But it's an interesting card, and I would like to see how people use it. So now we're up to the Ironborn, and the reason I got this pack in the first place, Refurbished Hulk. I am a real sucker for non-limited econ cards, especially non-unique ones, because they're just great for setup. I mean, they're just basically cheats around the econ curve that the game is trying to make you abide by. Unfortunately, mid-game, they're not great. Paying 2 during your turn for something like this that gives you +1 gold and +1 initiative that won't help right away, and that is honestly going to help a little bit, but incrementally over time, is not fantastic. Those stats for 2, great in setup, meh elsewise, except for the fact that 1, Ironborn or Greyjoys really do like winning initiative. They have cards that help them do it. They have a lot of good locations and things that rely on that. So that is helpful. They are the faction that cares about it the most, even though it's negligible. But what's really great is that this is a non-unique worship that you can just splash in. There's a lot of cards that benefit from just having worships. Victarion makes you kneel them. Drowned Men get strength for each one that you have. You can use Support of Harlaw on a character to then kneel a worship to have it gain some pretty nice keywords. The problem with that is that a lot of worships like to kneel themselves. So you're basically choosing to give that character a keyword. Same with Victarion. When you kneel a worship, you're choosing to give him some special power, or with Support of Harlaw, some keyword, at the cost of not getting to use that worship's ability. These guys don't care at all about kneeling. You can totally kneel them, and it basically just procs Support of Harlaw, Victarion, and passively helps Drowned Men and a bunch of other stuff. I mean, when you put this into play for 2, you can immediately put Eager Deckhand into play from your hand, which is very helpful because that saves you 2 gold, so this in a way sort of pays for itself. You can use Silence to put it into play from your hand for free. This is just an amazing card because not only is it a splashable econ, it's a non-unique worship whose benefits don't come from kneeling it. So really top-notch card in my opinion. I think I might overuse it because I keep drawing it in mid-game, and obviously I ran out of copies, but I think it's fantastic. Next is Iron Victory's Crew. It is a 5 cost with no attachments, so no throwing axe, even though it is Ironborn. But the Ironborn and Raider traits are both great. Ironborn means you can resurrect it with Aeron Damphair. The Raider trait is really more helpful. The Raider trait has been getting a lot of support recently. You can also use the old card Nighttime Raid to give it stealth, which wouldn't be terrible. But really what this guy is it's one of those 5 cost marshalling actions that like has insane searchability and then is a body on the board but doesn't really do much else. You can basically search your deck for any warship, and if it happens to be Iron Victory, then you put it into play. Otherwise you add it to your hand. Like most warships, Iron Victory is the personal warship of one of the big Greyjoy characters, in this case Victorian Greyjoy, and what it does is Victorian Greyjoy gets +1 strength for every power he has, which is good because both versions of Victorion can gain power pretty easily. One of them can kneel warships to gain renown, and the other one I think just has renown. So that will just buff them up. And another thing that it does is after a character is saved, you can give it a power. So the interesting thing about that is that one of the versions, the non-loyal version of Victorian Greyjoy, can actually save characters by discarding power from himself. So this helps mitigate that cost a little bit. But you could also just use a bunch of things like Risen from the Sea, Iron Mines, Maester Kerwin, and then rely on cards like Aeron Damphair to reward you for saving your characters. There's 2 kind of weird different Greyjoy strategies that have to do with, your characters dying. One has to do with saving them, the other has to do with killing them. Very opposite. They don't go well together. I guess you could trigger kills just to trigger saves, just to trigger abilities, but that seems like a lot. So I've never really tried out this saving strategy. I don't think this is a great card for Iron Victory. If there is a warship that you really want, and you're not just going to use Euron to search silence, you can just play this. But the thing is warships like Great Kraken is a really good card. So is Black Wind. But they're best if you have their characters out, although not necessary. But they're not that expensive. So playing 5 to search for them rather than having multiple copies. This card is important to exist. There are so many warship cards. Some of them are defining, and some decks are just defined by having a lot of warships. So having these options is good based on what you need. But it's a little bit weird that it specifies Iron Victory, which I consider to be one of the worst ones in a warship deck. Actually, I guess because Victorion is so good, the 7 cost version with warships, maybe it's not one of the worst ones, but this is kind of a pricey cost to pay to search for a warship. Although, you know what? I'm going to write this off as a good card. It's necessary. Moving on to Targaryens, we have Drogon. Now, this is a big boy version of Drogon. It's not the little baby, but it's not the biggest one. He's pretty good, though. He has Ambush, which, again, is the same as his cost, which is just awesome. Like, for no downside, that's just great. Why would you ever not ambush him? He also has no attachments because he's a freaking dragon. So after he wins a challenge, which he is a monogon, but he has 6 strength, you can pick a character your opponent controls. They get -4, and then they die if their strength is 0. There's obviously a lot of Targaryen cards that can lower strength further, and a lot of Targaryen cards, including their plot card, that can kill things if their strength is 0. This is a really great way to do that. What's interesting about this is because he's a monogon, you're going to win with him military, but then his effect activates before your opponent applies a claim. So if they only have one character, for example, whose strength is 4 or lower, this order is advantageous for you because normally they would kill that for claim, so you didn't have any targets, but now you can kill that and then force them to kill something else for claim. Basically, it's just a double military challenge. Even if it doesn't work somehow, even if there's not something you can kill, or even if you just don't want to, giving -4 to something else maybe that your opponent really needed is good. This is just a really good Targaryen strategy because reducing things' strength until you kill them is great because killing things is great, but reducing their strengths in the meantime is also just good as well. They're not going to be effective during the challenges phase, and if their strength is reduced too much, they just die. -4 is big. Not a lot of things can survive that, and combined with like a plot card or another Targaryen event, like almost nothing can. So your opponent is really going to have to make sure that they block his military challenges. I think he would go well in a Dothraki deck. That would be pretty cool. So I think this is a pretty good version of Drogon, but you have to choose between, this and the other big one for what you're going to target for Fire Made Flesh when you play it on your baby. The next one is in Daznak's Pit, the titular card, and honestly such a cool one. It's 5 costs total to play this from Shadow. And you basically just, after the challenges phase ends, stand everything and have another challenges phase. This is super unique because once per phase triggers, can trigger again. A lot of things will reset after the phase is over that you did, so it'll kind of start from scratch, but not everything and not power you gain. What I particularly like this in is a deck that uses the plot card Turning for the King as a win condition. Turning for the King is a card that gives all knights renown until the end of the turn, so you can really use it to push for victory if you have a board with like 5 or 6 knights and you just do one challenge with all of them probably military and get 6. Then if there's another challenges phase, you can do that again. In particular, if you're using the White Book's agenda and you're using a Kingsguard deck, you can already do that again by doing an entry or whatever type of challenge with as many of your knights as you can, kneeling your faction card, assuming you control a king. In this case, it would probably have to be his star or something you equipped with Beggar King, or maybe Golden Crown if you're like a complete savage. But assuming you have your king out, which if you're running a White Book's deck, you probably should, you can charge in with this plot card out. Let's say you have 5 of them, they get 5 power from their renowns. After you win, you stand them all because you have a king, you get 5 more power, and then you pop this out and you get 5 more power and just push for win. It's honestly really insane. That card in particular lets you push for victory so much, and having a second chance of doing that is kind of busted. This card is expensive though, and it's not always obvious if this is going to be like super advantageous for you. Like maybe you'll come out a little bit on top in the second challenges phase, but your opponent might be able to fight back 2 as well. So paying 3 to go into another challenges phase is so cool and such a breaking of one of the game's normal mechanics, but questionably hard to use. Another Maester card starts Dorn off. It's Maester Miles. So you take a look at the number of plot cards in your use pile, then you pick a character whose printed cost is equal or lower than that, and it loses a challenge icon. Of course, because he's a Maester, he kneels himself. You could use Defiance, but whatever. This is pretty good. He's non-loyal, so you can splash him into the Conclave deck. And his ability, though synergizing with Dorn, because Dorn has things like Ricasso and at Prince Dorian's behest that help you fill up your plot used pile, this is also just kind of a natural thing that happens over the course of the game, right? Like, you can make characters lose challenge icons that are just like weak to give you unopposed challenges, and then over time as the game progresses he becomes stronger and stronger. I don't think he's that good. There are a lot of better ways of making your opponent lose challenge icons, and he has to kneel himself. But if in late game, you draw into a 2 cost that you can just put on your board to get an extra challenge icon removal in addition to your like Starfall and all your Shadow City Bastards and your Shadow Ariane Martel, I could see it working out. Again, he also just has a great trait in general. Next Dorn event is interesting. I never really run it, but I think it's kind of cool. It's a 0 cost event, which is always great. I actually do think I run 1 copy of it in my Dark Wings, Dark Words deck, because it's a 0 cost event. When they would use any triggered ability other than agenda or plot, you can cancel the effect immediately, which is insane that it applies to anything, but they can stop it by paying you a gold. I don't really run it just because it's weird, but it's really good. There's a similar card called Words or Wind that has an effect where you cancel their event unless they let you draw 2 cards. The difference here is that they might not have a gold. That is possible. They can always let you draw 2 cards. But there are situations where for 0 cost, you can negate anything they do and there's nothing you can do to stop it. In addition, though, it might take up space in your hand that better cards can come in, you can always play this card. And you can save it till the right time because it's 0 cost. Then your opponent either can't negate it, or even if they can, that's going to mess up their calculations for the gold that turn. What you should not do is rely on this to make your own calculations for gold that turn. You shouldn't go into the challenges phase with not enough to pay for your shadow thing and assume that playing this is going to help you, because your opponent might choose to not give it to you. They might need their gold. But it is really great to have a 0 cost event that can negate anything and has situations where there's nothing your opponent can do to stop it. Like, that's really powerful. Obviously, it's going to be more likely your opponent won't have gold during the challenges phase, but they might be running a deck that just tosses everything and marshaling. I mean, that would telegraph most of their options, but wouldn't telegraph something like this. So I think this is a good card. It's just kind of hard to put in because it doesn't really follow any particular strategy. It's just kind of good. Okay, on to the neutrals, and we have a really interesting shadow card, honestly super unique in what he does. Old Bill Bone, kind of a staple, and depending on the matchup. He's cheap to play, but you wouldn't want to do that. You would want to outshadow him, which would take 3 total, and then you kneel your opponent's faction card. This can honestly just shut down entire agendas for a turn, and if you have ways of putting him back into shadow, like Clever Feint, or even Castle Guard, the Baratheon card. Castle Guard also is non-loyal, so it can be run in a Kingdom of Shadows deck. That's great. That's really, really good. Oh, or you could use Tyrion. But also, Bill Bone can be summoned in a Kingdom of Shadows deck by Aegon because he's a mercenary card. So you can summon him with Aegon. That's not going to do much, but then he returns to your hand, and then you can use him next turn. That is going to telegraph it to your opponent, and there's probably better options for if you bring out Aegon, but it is an interesting way to search Old Bill Bone in a deck that would be using Shadow. Mercenaries in general also just have a lot more support right now. I mean, there's a whole agenda that has to do with mercenaries and gold. There's a lot of new cards that have really solidified the synergy between mercenaries and bestow and gold. And so that's just not a bad trait at all to have. But that's not why you talk about him. You talk about Old Bill Bone because he's a threat. If your opponent has a card in Shadows, it could be the only card in Shadows they run in their entire deck, or they could have a million cards in Shadows. But there's a good chance Old Bill Bone is one of them. Him coming out of Shadows can also trigger a bunch of abilities like Cersei or Arianne, depending on if you're running those decks. Even otherwise, this is the only card in the game that can kneel an opponent's faction card. That is insane. That can shut down a lot of stuff. So don't sleep on Old Bill Bone. He's out there. He's in the meta, and you got to know he's there. We have a location now in at the crossroads that I'm a little bit torn about. I've tried to use it a couple times. It's all right. I don't think that the shadow is necessary, but sure, it has shadow. You can also just play it for 2, and then during Dom, you kneel it, give it to your opponent, and draw 3 cards. So it's kind of like Brawn or the Night's Watch attachment Turn Cloak. It's designed to, go back and forth between players. 3 cards is great. That's a lot. It might put you over reserve because it happens during Dominance right before taxation. And you are giving your opponent a card, which would be savage to combo with trade routes if you gave your opponent in at the crossroads, then you use trade routes, gained 1 extra gold. Trade routes, I'll point out, also has been errated now to only include your opponent's locations, not your own as well. So that would actually be a combo now, which would be kind of funny. Other than that, I mean, what are you going to do with the fact that your opponent has more locations? I guess if you're about to use Political Disaster, you could do that. Then if you have King's Landing, you can marshal this back from your discard pile. It's an interesting card. It's a very good splashable neutral location if your deck is just a little thin on card advantage and you don't really want to necessarily put that in the plot deck or more in the main deck. You can just splash in a copy or 2 of this. Searchable by support of the people. Pretty decent in setup. I've never actually seen it go as the card seems to intend to want to go, of players trading it back and forth, but maybe I just haven't run it correctly. I think it's a cool neutral card. I really like it. I don't really understand why it's Shadow. This next card, I understand exactly why it is Shadow, and it's one of the best Shadow cards. It's an attachment, Pinch of Powder, that is non-terminal, I'll point out. It's an item and a weapon, so it's searchable by Streets of Steel. It's also ambushable if you have Raiders of Pike. It is so good because what you do is you declare your attackers, your opponent declares their defenders, and then when you know you're about to win by 5 or more, you just whip this outer shadow whenever you want, attach it to anything your opponent has. It doesn't have to be participating. Then it goes back to their hand. Then this goes back to your hand. So now your opponent knows you have it, but that's really good. You don't have to play it until you know the conditions are met. In general, this is pretty good. I mean, giving you the option of 2 challenges instead of just 1 that you can win by 5 or more, as opposed to put to the sword, put to the torch, support of the people, Duran's game, etc. inherently makes this easier to use. You can whip it out of shadows at the last second, so it's barely even an attachment. It might as well be an event. And returning it to the hand, it's not really as good as killing it, but you could then, if you got this with a power challenge, you could then do an intrigue challenge and try and get rid of it. That would be pretty sassy. Yeah, and then it just goes back to your hand. I mean, this card is not really that expensive. You can also bluff it out. You can put something else into shadows and not this card, and then your opponent has to be afraid of this card. This card and the other card, Poisoned Coin, which is a shadow event, are the two things that if your opponent is meta savvy and they know the existence of, they must play around. They have to stop you from getting unopposed challenges with characters with shadow to prevent Poisoned Coin, and they have to make sure that you don't win by more than like 4 to prevent Pinch of Powder. Like, your opponent's going to know this. So like, whether you're running these, whether you have drawn them or not, you have to play around this. And this applies to you as well. If you see your opponent is running shadow cards, like, be careful. If you have to let them win, let them win, but by 5 or more, that can be deadly. This is a really, really, really good card. And it's an attachment, so it benefits from all sorts of attachment support, though most attachment support is restricted to characters you control. And lastly, it is worth mentioning that the best cards you could use it on, which are like the big dragons and the armies, are actually immune to this because they have no attachments, which is kind of annoying. But you know what? I think it's fair. Last card is a plot card. I used to think it was really good, but I don't think I do anymore, but it has its place. It's called Double Dealing. Really, really solid stats across the board. 5 gold, solid. 7 initiative, very nice. 6 reserve is exactly what you'd expect. Same with Claim. During the plot phase, it's not actually a win revealed. You pick a plot card in your opponent's use pile, and then it gains its text until you reveal a new plot card. Now, the problem with this card is that it can't copy when revealeds, which are like, when revealed plot cards are like the most used plot cards in the entire game and the best. So you're not going to always have a target for this, and if you do, it's probably something that affects the board state in a way that's advantageous to your opponent. Not necessarily, but it's unreliable to run in your deck. Its stats are really good, but sometimes you're just going to play it and nothing else is going to happen, and that's not usually worth it for a plot card. You can't copy a board wipe. You can't copy the gold of a plot card. So a lot of aspects of plot cards you can't copy. You can't copy the claim. You can copy something like At the Palace of Sorrows or whatever, but like, your opponent's probably ready for that if they're running it. What I think this is really meant for is a Reigns of Castamere deck where you don't have to put it in, your plot deck proper, but you have it in this side deck of scheme cards, because it is a scheme, which also combos well with some other landy cards like a very large shadow, for instance. But you can play this out from Reigns of Castamere when you win an Intrigue challenge. It's a lot safer in a Reigns of Castamere side deck because, the opportunity cost of putting this thing in your plot deck when it might be a dud and you only have 7 cards you can pick and they're kind of really important is pretty high. But putting it in your Reigns of Castamere like deck of options is a little more safe. And when this thing pops, it can really pop. I mean, you're using your opponent's cards against them. So in general, I don't like the idea. I mean, I know you have to play around the meta sometimes, and I just gave a bunch of advice on shadow cards you should look out for, but I don't like the idea of building my deck based around assumptions about what's in my opponent's deck. I do think it's a cool option to have if you're doing Reigns of Castamere, but I think in a main deck, despite the good stats and good looking ability, it's not worth it. Okay, yeah. This has been a long time coming. Sorry I was away for so long, but I've brushed up on all the rules, guys. Been back into deck building, which means I'm going to use more cards, which means I'm going to need more packs, which means I'll probably make more of these. So it's good to be back. I hope like all 15 of my subscribers are happy to see me.